April 1944. 7 Messerschmitts hang in the sky above him, like vultures circling wounded prey. His fuel needle trembles on empty. His radio spits nothing but static. He doesn't bank. He doesn't run. He simply floats there, waiting. The German flight leader tips his nose toward attack, and still, this American waits. What those enemy pilots will never understand is that from the instant they appeared on the horizon, this man has been counting heartbeats, and inside his head, the killing has already begun. The spring of 1940 transformed the skies over Western Europe into a grinding machine of attrition. American heavy bombers painted white contrails across occupied France and Belgium with mechanical regularity each dawn, scattered beneath those vapor trails. The twisted aluminum carcasses of previous raids decorated farmland, forests, and village squares. The 8th Air Force hemorrhaged aircrews at a rate that outpaced every replacement pipeline. For every industrial target reduced to rubble, 36 young men evaporated into flames or barbed wire prison camps. Fighter escorts pushed their operational radius deeper with each passing week. The P-51 Mustang had finally granted American pilots the entrance to penetrate deep into German territory. But extended range created fresh nightmares. Fuel calculations became matters of survival. A single navigational error meant death. And Luftwaffe tactics mutated with every encounter. German interceptor pilots had grown cunning through bitter experience. They learned to observe rather than attack immediately. They allowed the bomber formations to pass overhead unmolested. They studied escort patterns with predatory patience. Then they pounced on stragglers, on wounded aircraft, on any machine that strayed from the protective herd. This approach was methodical. It was merciless, and it devastated American formations with terrible efficiency. At RAF Debden in the Essex countryside, the 4th Fighter Group operated from a former British station where the walls still sweated. Moisture and the permanent smell of aviation fuel hung in every corridor. Maintenance crews labored through darkness, sealing punctured fuselages and replacing ruptured coolant lines. Intelligence officers tracked casualty figures that escalated with each 7-day period. Young pilots composed farewell letters to wives and mothers, letters they prayed would never require mailing. The distinctive thunder of Merlin power plants shattered the morning stillness as another mission prepared for departure. Pre-flight inspections, oxygen system checks, weapons calibration confirmed. Every aviator carried an invisible burden shaped by statistics they all understood. 25% would never complete their combat tours. 10% would not return from this very day. Among these men was someone the squadron had gradually learned to respect, though nothing about his demeanor suggested anything exceptional. He contributed little during mission briefings. He never boasted in the officers' club. He listened with unusual intensity. He processed information, and when he climbed into a cockpit, something in his split-second decisions separated him from even the most talented flyers in the unit. His name was Captain Robert Johnson, and by that spring of 1944, he had endured what statistically should have killed him many times over. The ground crews recognized him as the aviator who returned with aircraft so thoroughly destroyed that engineering officers preserved the wreckage for instructional purposes. The weapons technicians knew him as the pilot who inventoried his ammunition before and after every engagement, tracking every round like an accountant balancing ledgers. The intelligence analysts recognized him as the airman whose combat narratives read like technical specifications, stripped of emotion, packed with precision. He violated every stereotype. He pursued no personal glory. He recounted no victories with theatrical flair or embellishment. When fellow pilots gathered to relive the day's aerial battles, Johnson isolated himself with gun camera reels, frame-by-frame analysis, deflection, geometry, closure velocity, rounds expended per target. What colleagues attributed to instinct, he attributed to mathematics. What others credited to fortune, he credited to preparation. If accounts like this resonate with you, consider subscribing so these overlooked stories of extraordinary thinking receive the recognition they deserve. Robert Samuel Johnson entered the world in Lawton, Oklahoma, in 1920. Red dust and endless horizons. A community where mechanical aptitude mattered more than formal education, and practical wisdom outweighed academic credentials. His father operated a modest automotive repair business. Johnson matured with petroleum stains permanently embedded beneath his fingernails and the fundamental logic of machinery wired into his consciousness. Mechanical systems made complete sense to him. Fuel delivery systems, ignition timing, valve adjustments, everything followed predictable rules. When something malfunctioned, you identified the source. When components failed, you understood the mechanism. He demonstrated no natural athletic gifts. He displayed minimal social inclination. He consumed technical documentation as entertainment. He comprehended interconnected systems intuitively, and when he examined aircraft, he perceived no romantic adventure. He observed an integrated assembly of components that either functioned in coordination or killed their operator. In 1941, he volunteered for the Army Air Corps, not from burning hatred or flag-waving fervor, though both emotions existed within him. He enlisted because aviation captivated him the same way engines did. It represented a puzzle combining physics, chemistry, and spatial reasoning. He intended to master it. Flight instruction revealed something his trainers had rarely encountered. Johnson proved neither the smoothest student nor the quickest learner, but his mechanical precision unsettled everyone who observed him. He navigated by numerical calculation. He computed fuel consumption mentally. He estimated altitude loss during banking maneuvers within 50 feet of actual readings. Where classmates depended on sensory feedback, Johnson depended on quantification. One instructor recorded in Johnson's evaluation that the cadet flew like an engineer, impersonating a combat pilot. The observation was not intended as praise, but it captured something essential. By the time Johnson achieved operational status and deployed to England during early 1943, he had accumulated substantial cockpit time and cultivated a reputation for being disturbingly systematic. He consumed alcohol sparingly. He avoided romantic pursuits during London furloughs. He devoured after-action analyses. He interrogated returning aviators about German methodology. He sketched engagement geometries in a personal notebook that never left his possession. Fellow pilots considered him peculiar. Some found him emotionally distant. None considered him incompetent. His initial victories came during the summer of 1943. Precise, economical, zero-wasted ammunition. He positioned himself advantageously, delivered abbreviated firing bursts, verified destruction. Then he withdrew and resumed escort responsibilities. No celebratory aerobatics, no radio commentary, just mission execution. By that year's conclusion, his tally had expanded, so had his comprehension of the adversary. He learned to identify Luftwaffe unit markings from silhouette recognition alone. He committed to memory the performance parameters of the Focke-Wulf 190 and Messerschmitt 109. He calculated their turning capabilities, their climbing performance, their fuel constraints. He analyzed them the way a grandmaster studies chess. Openings, not with admiration, with the intention of destruction. But Johnson had absorbed another lesson that most aviators would never grasp. He understood the tactical value of appearing vulnerable, of projecting weakness when strength remained hidden, of permitting opponents to believe they controlled the engagement, until the precise instant you demonstrated otherwise. This required a variety of patience that demanded absolute confidence in your own calculations. And during one particular mission in April 1944, that patience would face its ultimate examination. The mission briefing contained nothing unusual. Escort heavy bombers to a synthetic petroleum facility near Leipzig. Provide high cover throughout initial penetration. Defend against interceptors during the bombing approach. Shepherd damaged aircraft back toward the English Channel. Johnson's flight launched at first light. For Mustangs, each loaded with maximum internal fuel capacity plus underwing auxiliary tanks. Weather conditions showed scattered cloud formations, with visibility sufficient for combat. They climbed through cumulus layers and assembled over the British coastline. Below them, the grey expanse of the North Sea spread like hammered metal. Ahead, the European continent waited somewhere in that direction. German radar technicians were already plotting the incoming formation. The bomber stream droned eastward at 22,000 feet. Johnson's flight maintained station 3,000 feet above. The atmosphere was brilliant and frigid. Contrails extended behind them like chalk markings on slate. 60 minutes into hostile territory, initial attacks materialized. Focke-Wulf's plunging from directly above. Johnson's element broke to intercept. Tracer fire crossed the sky. One German fighter spiraled downward, trailing dark smoke. Another disengaged and dove toward ground level. Johnson refused pursuit. His responsibility was the bombers. He reset his defensive position and scanned the horizon systematically. Then his wingman's voice crackled warning. A second wave. Messerschmitts climbing from below, positioning for a rear-quarter assault on the bomber stream. Johnson rolled his flight into a slashing descent. The Germans observed their approach and dispersed. No confirmed kills. No losses sustained. The bombers proceeded unscathed. But now Johnson's fuel situation had deteriorated. The combat maneuvering had consumed reserves faster than planning predicted. He examined his gauges, sufficient to reach home. Marginally, the bomber stream pivoted westward following weapons release. Anti-aircraft fire had claimed to flying fortresses. A third was losing altitude with one engine shut down. Johnson's flight shifted to cover the wounded aircraft. That was when his wingman's radio failed. Then his own. Equipment malfunction or combat damage to relay aircraft. Either explanation left him flying isolated. Hand signals exclusively, and fuel still evaporating with every passing minute. The crippled bomber fell progressively behind. Johnson remained with it, weaving protectively above, scanning without pause. His fuel indicator now showed below minimum safe return levels. A decision approached. Abandon the wounded bomber and run for the coast, or remain until replacement escorts arrived. He remained. 30 miles from the French frontier, the Germans discovered them. They approached from the north, 7 Messerschmitt 109s in loose formation, flying at identical altitude, not diving, not climbing, simply matching pace. Johnson identified them immediately. His pulse remained steady. His grip on the control column stayed relaxed. He simply noted their location and initiated calculations. 7 hostile aircraft. 1 crippled bomber lacking defensive formation support. Johnson's flight reduced to 3. Effective fighters, fuel critical, radio inoperative, and the enemy had not yet committed to attack. That final observation revealed everything. These Germans were not inexperienced replacements. They were watching. waiting, expecting the Americans to panic, waiting for someone to abandon formation discipline and present an isolated target. Johnson waggled his wings to capture his wingman's attention. He indicated the enemy formation, then tapped his helmet. Maintain discipline. Wait. Seconds elongated. The bombers lumbered westward. The Messerschmitts paced them like predators flanking wounded game. One of Johnson's element drifted forward, instinct drawing him toward the threat. Johnson chopped his hand downward sharply. Hold position. The German formation adjusted slightly. Still no attack developed. They were analyzing the Americans now, estimating fuel states, watching for indicators of weakness. And then Johnson perceived it. The lead Messerschmitt edged forward almost imperceptibly, testing response. Johnson provided no reaction. Additional seconds elapsed. The German advanced again, now to enemy fighters angled outward, preparing to bracket the escort formation. Still Johnson held position. His wingman glanced across, confusion evident even through the oxygen apparatus. Why weren't they engaging? Because Johnson was counting. He was measuring closure rates and fuel consumption and attack angles. He was observing German movement patterns, and he was waiting for the singular moment when their confidence would transform into assumption. The lead Messerschmitt pitched nose down, just 5 degrees. The initiation of an attack run. Now the others began committing. To broke right, to broke left. The loose formations spread into attack geometry, and that was when Johnson moved. He rolled inverted and pulled, not toward the closest enemy, toward the leader, the one who had committed first and deepest. The Mustang dropped like a hunting falcon. Airspeed climbed. 400 knots. 420. The Germans observed his descent and broke hard left. Too late. Johnson had not been reacting. He had been anticipating. He fired a 2-second burst. 50 caliber rounds walked across the Messerschmitt's fuselage. Components separated. The canopy exploded. The fighter snapped into an uncontrolled spin and fell away. Johnson never watched it descend. He was already reversing. The 2 Germans who had broken right were now climbing back, attempting to re-engage. But Johnson had calculated their fuel state also. They had flown out to intercept. They had maneuvered extensively. They would not pursue a diving target all the way to minimum altitude. He confirmed this by diving another 1,000 feet. The 2 Messerschmitts hesitated, then leveled off. They had chosen self-preservation over vengeance. Above him, his wingman and element had engaged the remaining 4. Gunfire flickered across the sky. One German broke away streaming smoke. Another attempted to loop onto an American's tail and discovered Johnson climbing back into the engagement from below. Johnson lacked the angle for a killing shot. He didn't require one. The Messerschmitt pilot observed his approach and abandoned the attack. The German rolled away and dove for separation. Now the mathematics had shifted. 7 had become 4. 4 had become 3. And the 3 that remained were no longer hunting. They were calculating their own survival odds. Johnson climbed back to escort altitude. His fuel gauge showed red. Minutes remaining. Perhaps 10. Perhaps less. One surviving German made a tentative pass at the bomber. Johnson turned into him. The German refused to press. He pulled up and away. The other had already departed. Johnson reassembled his flight. The crippled bomber continued westward, trailing smoke, but maintaining flight. His wingman pulled alongside and raised a thumb. The radio remained dead, but the message transmitted clearly. They had survived. Johnson examined his fuel one final time. Insufficient to reach England. He would require an emergency strip on the coast. His element leader signaled identical problems. They crossed into friendly airspace 10 minutes later. Johnson identified the emergency field and entered the landing pattern. Landing gear extended, flaps deployed. The Mustang settled onto the metal planking with barely enough fuel to clear the runway. When he shut down the engine, his hands remained steady. His breathing stayed normal. He climbed out and walked to the operations tent to submit his report. The duty officer asked how many kills he was claiming. Johnson said 1 confirmed, possibly 2. Gun camera footage would determine the final count. The officer asked how he had managed 7 hostiles with a fuel emergency and dead radio. Johnson said he waited until they made a mistake. The officer pressed further. What mistake? Johnson looked at him directly. They assumed patience was weakness. They assumed silence was fear. They were wrong. Gun camera analysis confirmed 2 kills. Intelligence officers studied the engagement extensively. The geometry was unconventional. Johnson had violated standard doctrine. He had not turned into the initial threat. He had not engaged the nearest target. Instead, he had waited. And when he moved with such precise timing that the enemy formation collapsed. From within, one analyst noted that Johnson appeared to have deliberately withheld fire until the German leader was fully committed to his attack run. Another observed that Johnson's dive had not been defensive. It had been predatory, a calculated intercept based on predictive geometry. They requested he explain his thought process. Johnson said he had observed German maneuvers during previous missions. They followed patterns. They committed as a group once leadership committed. If you eliminated the leader at the moment of commitment, formation cohesion dissolved. It was not fortune. It was observation, pattern recognition, and the discipline to wait for the optimal moment even when instinct screamed for immediate action. Within weeks, his methodology was being taught in tactical briefings. Do not react, observe. Let the enemy commit, then strike at the decision-maker. Johnson's confirmed. Kills climbed steadily. By tour's end, he was credited with 27 confirmed aerial victories, establishing him among the highest-scoring American aces of the European theater. But the statistics never mattered to him the way they mattered to others. What mattered was that fewer bombers were lost, that fewer crews perished, because someone had learned to think instead of react. His squadron mates gradually understood what the quiet pilot had known. From the beginning, aggression without timing was noise. Courage without calculation was death. And in the aerial war over Europe, where fractions of seconds determined survival, the capacity to wait was the rarest skill of all. After the war, analysts examined Johnson's combat documentation. They discovered his average ammunition expenditure per kill was half that of comparable aces. His fuel management was textbook. His loss rate among pilots flying in his formations was measurably lower than average. He had not flown harder. He had flown smarter. And in doing so, he had demonstrated that war was not merely about bravery. It was about thinking clearly when everything around you demanded panic. Robert Johnson returned home in 1944. He did not publish memoirs. He did not tour giving lectures. He went back to Oklahoma and lived quietly. He worked as a flight instructor, briefly, then transitioned into aviation business management. He rarely discussed the war unless directly questioned, and when he did, his answers were brief, factual, stripped of sentiment. But those who flew with him never forgot what he had taught them, that the most powerful weapon in aerial combat was not the gun. It was the brain behind it. In the decades following, air combat evolved dramatically. Jets replaced propellers. Missiles replaced bullets. Radar replaced visual searching. But the principle Johnson had mastered remained eternal. Patience was still a weapon. Timing was still everything. And the ability to let your enemy believe they held advantage until the moment you proved otherwise was still the mark of a master. Johnson lived into his 80s. He attended reunions occasionally and spoke with historians when asked. He remained precise, methodical, unchanged by recognition he never pursued. When he died in 1998, obituaries noted his kills, his decorations, his rank. But they missed the deeper truth. Robert Johnson had not merely been an ace. He had been a thinker in a profession that rewarded action, a mathematician in a sky full of chaos. And his legacy was not the enemies he destroyed, it was the men he brought home. Because ultimately, the best pilots were not those who flew fastest or fired most. They were those who understood that survival was a calculation, and every second of patience was a second someone else got to live. Johnson knew that, and he proved it 7 times over in a single engagement that should have killed him. The quiet pilot who waited, who calculated, who transformed silence into a trap, and when the enemy finally struck, discovered that the trap had been theirs all along.